So my name is Robin, and the co-authors on here are from different parts of the Jackson School. So I work at the Bureau of Economic Geology, which is Mark Schuster's organization. 𝗕𝗀𝗿𝗺𝗺, for those geology students here in the room, of course, is from the geology department, which of course has a new name. It's EPS. Somebody help me out here. Thank you, planetary. So impressive title. I'll learn it before too long. And Xavier Janssen is my boss, who runs the Reservoir Characterization Research Laboratory up at the Bureau of Economic Geology. But we also work with researchers outside of UT, from Frank Mail from Penn State, Ian Duncan and Larry Lake are two names. Some of the engineers in the room know who Larry Lake is? Ah, see? Bunch of hands right there, right? So good. He was my student originally when I got my petroleum engineering degree at UT back in the early 90s. So, and he still collaborates with me on these sorts of projects so that it's we have a lot of fun. Great. So the overview for today is I'll be talking, as Hal already mentioned, we're going to be talking about _PARADISE, a convolutional neural network faulting, as well as a deep learning phases prediction. The good news is you're going to get some real experts talking about the detailed theory behind the science. So if you have a really complex science question, if you hold on to that, because I'm still getting started on the technology, and they of course will be the best people to answer that one. But don't hesitate. If you have any questions, let us know. The workflow that we use at the Bureau of Economic Geology has for a long time focused on the 𝗕𝗀𝗿𝗺𝗺 software, for which we have received a very nice donation from 𝗕𝗀𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺, and we have a lot of users for that. But it needed to be augmented with some more advanced seismic interpretation capabilities, which in recent years, 𝗕𝗀𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺 and I, together with Xavier Janssen, developed inside the RCRL group using the 𝗕𝗲𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺 software, capable of doing very rapid sequence stratigraphic based and geomorphologically founded seismic horizon tracking. But we needed a tool to be able to do much more advanced lithophases prediction and more fault prediction. And that's what we found in 𝗕𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺. So what I'm showing you right here is basically the top 3 products which we can no longer live without in all of our subsurface studies. And that is the 𝗕𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺𝗺, _PARADISE, and 𝗕LEOscan. So the inspiration for this segment of the presentation is all about this part of the presentation is about the Permian Basin model. And the reason why we're talking about a large Permian Basin model is for machine learning, as all of you who have done any machine learning in the room needs lots and lots of data. So we saw this coming. So what we've been doing for the last couple of years at the Bureau is gather all this data. Right? And the inspiration for building this big model came from some of the cross sections that were built back in the 1950s, 60s, and 1980s. And I'm showing some of those on the left-hand side right there. In the lower right-hand corner, we show 𝗕𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃 cross section that represents the overall shelf, the slope, the basin geology in the all-important Permian Basin, Delaware Basin, where we really have to have a good understanding of the stratigraphy. And we've obtained that from almost 40 years worth of field work in the Guadalupe Mountains and other outcrops in West Texas, which has been turned into many dissertations and many theses that Charlie based this particular cross-section on. And I use this cross-section, this conceptual stratigraphic layering cross-section, to guide me in all of my interpretations for the well logs and the seismic of all of the studies that we do in the Permian Basin. So all of these things kind of came together over the last couple of decades and years, and I decided about 5 years ago that we needed to build a 3-dimensional model of the entire Permian Basin. Well, when I arrived at the UT back in 1989, I saw a cross-section hanging on the wall, and that's the one that pretty much every oil company has hanging in their corporate headquarters, which is the famous 1984 west to east cross-section. You can see the key map right there on the left of the stratigraphy in the Permian Basin. And after several years of building a Permian Basin model, I asked myself, okay, well, are we close enough to being able to match this excellent work done by geologists for this 2-dimensional cross-section with the contribution of many people at the time, and they're referred to as the famous West Texas Geological Society cross-sections. So That's what we'll touch upon a little bit later in this presentation. But within the Permian Basin, one of the things that we focus the 𝗕𝗿𝗿𝗺𝗺 technology on is fault identification as well as 𝗕𝗏𝗿𝗍𝗍 prediction. So back to the 3D model for the Permian Basin. In order to have the best possible data set for all of our machine learning initiatives, right, we effectively used all of the data that we can license from the industry, that we can get donated from various oil companies, that of course we have in our over 100 years of history at the Bureau of Economic Geology. And over the last 5 years, we've been integrating all of that data together into one place, right? Okay, what software do we use for that? What is our basic database? And that's indeed the 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗆 software. The project that we've built is 550 gigabytes in size. It takes 30 minutes to come up every morning. And all of my technical friends at 𝗕𝗀𝗿𝗺𝗁 tell me that, you know, it's going to crash any day now. So, but luckily, the software and the hardware is so good these days that it keeps chugging away, and I keep adding more data to it. So it's been very encouraging being able to integrate all this data together. So what do we have? We have approximately 360,000 wells that contain stratigraphy data. And that's, of course, the well log tops that we use in order to build the zonation throughout the Permian Basin. Right? And for those of you not too familiar, looking at the Permian Basin, what you see right there is, of course, you see that big L shape right there. That's the boundary between the border between New Mexico and Texas. You see on the left-hand side the Delaware Basin in the middle, the Central Basin Platform. On the right, you have the Midland Basin. Right? So that's how many wells we have with stratigraphy data. Then we have well log data. And also with the help of our collaborators in the TextNet group, we've been able to get our hands on quite a bit of data that we use for petrophysical calculations. And this particular slide shows 7,000 of the highest quality quad combo wells, as we call them, with all the various well logs in it that we need in order to calculate high quality petrophysical data, such as porosity, water saturation, and permeability. And then the tops I was talking about earlier in those 360,000 wells result in approximately 3.2 million tops for the whole basin. Then, through the very generous donation of seismic volumes from a wide variety of oil companies that do joint research with the Jackson School, we've been able to bring approximately 38 three-dimensional surveys and over 2,500 regional 2D lines, all within the same project. Right? And then this is some examples of some of Charlie's students and 𝗣𝗿𝗍𝗺𝗺 students who have built these high-resolution correlation frameworks that go from shelf to slope to basin. And then here's an example of how we use some of the petrophysical data that we've started to calculate and bring those into that same environment. So this is what a three-dimensional model looks like of the Permian Basin. Right? And then this is a fence diagram showing approximately, currently we have over 50 horizons mapped in the Permian Basin for the entire area. And the 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗆 model is now up to 2.4 billion cells. And this is a little animation that shows you from the basement, moving up to the Ellenberger, and all of the actual horizons mapped across the Permian Basin, all the way to the surface. So you build a model like this, 2.4 billion cells, on a pretty decent computer, but we are incredibly lucky here at UT because we get these wonderful academic discounts. So the computer that I use literally was purchased for $12,000. That sounds like a lot of money to some of you, but when you think about the computing power that you need these days, it's pretty affordable. They come from a company called Lambda in California. It comes with 32 CPUs, gives you 64 threads. It comes with 512 gigabytes of RAM. It comes with multiple graphics cards, exactly the sort of stuff you need to do these sort of studies. And we have many of those available here at the Jackson School. So here are some examples of some of these different zones. But the point I wanted to make with these two pictures is that the resolution of the model is high enough that we're not over-averaging things. If you take a look at the picture on the left right there, that's the famous Sack Rock fields in Scurry County, which is at one point in time was one of the biggest producers in the United States, been developed for over close to 100 years now. And all of that detail of that reef-like structure, you see the buildup right there, right, is still maintained in this regional model, right? So. More detailed models we've incorporated as well, such as a field in the Midland Basin, generously donated by the Fasken Oil and Ranch Company, right? So the whole idea is that we don't just do the research on the regional model, we link in high resolution field models in order to be able to make all of the stratigraphy and the attribute distributions consistent between the smaller scale as well as the wider regional scale. And here's what the model looks like when it's cut at the famous 𝗲𝗿𝗱𝗶𝗀𝗃 interval across the Permian Basin. And one of the initial purposes of this model was to build a three-dimensional velocity model, mainly for the TextNet group, for the main purpose of doing the time depth conversion of the seismic volumes, as well as for the very important earthquakes associated with the saltwater disposal that Mark Schuster mentioned in his intro. You know, a lot of earthquakes happening. We need to be able to properly locate those in the subsurface in three-dimensional space. We need very high resolution velocity models for that, and that's one of the purposes of this model. Which means that at a certain point, at the top, I show the actual layering structure that we've used, and at the bottom, I show the distribution of these velocities. And this is a set of cross sections from west to east. We're looking at the Permian Basin from the southeast corner, and those are the actual, what are those, the zones? And these are the velocity distributions right there. So the question was, do I feel comfortable enough to put up the famous 1984 West Texas Geological Society cross-section and actually compare it to the same cross-section extracted from my own model? And last year, right before a big West Texas Geological Society meeting, I said, let me give it a try. It was a Sunday. I said, what could happen, right? So I pulled it in, and this is what I got. I'll let you be the judge. Right? If you look closely, you can see a lot of, you see some glitches, right? A little vertical pattern in there needs to be cleaned up. Maybe some of the basement data needs to be updated. But overall, you can see that we now are capable to make a cross-section for an entire 2.4 billion cell model where we can move the cross-section anywhere we want, right? And then still validate it using the very famous West Texas Geological Society cross-section. And we did that for all the other cross-sections that the West Texas Geological Society has published over the last 70 years. So. And here's some more fence diagrams with velocities. And here is an overview of the Permian Basin with green polygons representing the 3D seismic data that has been generously donated to us, or that the Bureau is actually has licensed from a wide variety of seismic data vendors in the Permian Basin. The black dots represent all of the well logs for which we have enough high quality raw data in order for us to be able to calculate petrophysical data. So those are the two main inputs for any 𝗕𝗿𝗏𝗺 lithofacies prediction model. You need well logs with petrophysical data, you need core data, and you need the 3D seismic data. So this is the work that we're currently undertaking with 𝗕𝗿𝗏𝗺, right? We for every single one of these green areas, we are combining the petrophysical data with the seismic data in order to calculate facies predictions. And the facies predictions will then go into three-dimensional models with layering structures. Those colors that you see on the well logs right there, those are the high-resolution petrophysical multi-mineral calculations, and all of that is used to build a three-dimensional model. And then, apart from building three-dimensional velocity models, we go further and further downstream in the direction of the engineering. So we integrate all of the production data that you can see right here for the 𝗲𝗿𝗃𝗃, all of the horizontal well trajectories with landing zones, estimated ultimate recovery for water, liquids, water cuts, oil production, so on and so forth. So the model also functions as a basis for reserve estimations as well as for investigations related to well productivity and facies distributions. This next picture shows a slide from the north, kind of give you an idea of, what it looks like if you combine all of the historical data. That's one of those West Texas Geological Society cross-sections in the back, together with seismic cross-sections and fence diagrams and all of the horizontal well producers. So now we're getting somewhere. Now we're starting to build basically models that have enough data that are deserving of using tools like 𝗕𝗿𝗏𝗺 and other artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques in order to be able to test all of our hypotheses. So we started to test 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁 last year in a beautiful data set that was donated to us by TGS, the West Lindsay project. And I simply had a question. I said, look, I've already done a fault interpretation on this manually. So how good is 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁 in being able to come in there and run its convolutional neural network fault detection and identify the faults that I can then compare to my original interpretation? So I'll quickly step through these slides. We have this fault framework integrated into the cross-section. There you see the faults that were calculated and identified by the 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁 software. Right? And then I show the actual seismic. And then we show these faults extracted as three-dimensional surfaces. And then we can color them by different parameters, such as the size of the fault, the areal extent, as well as the confidence of the fault, and then filter it down to the faults that we know we are the most confident in, that have been properly predicted. And these are the faults right there. Now, that surface that you see in color is a very important surface. It's the basement surface. So if you do any sort of research on saltwater disposal or earthquake occurrences in the Delaware Basin, it's all linked to the faults that are rooted in the basement. So it's very nice that these faults were identified by 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁. And if I then look at the prior fault interpretation, you can see that they match extremely well. So that gave me a lot of comfort. It basically proved to me that 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁 is able to interpret all of the critical faults rooted in the basement automatically and a lot faster than what I had to do using the manual fault interpretation. Because now I could take the 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁𝗁 faults, integrate them into my actual three-dimensional model, start building a layer model, and then create a three-dimensional volumetric model of this this section of the southern Delaware Basin. And then apart from actually comparing it with my original interpretation, I can also compare it with larger scale regional faults that were obtained for many different sources. So this is an incredibly fast way to go interpret your faults and build your three-dimensional subsurface model. So then we applied the 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁𝗁 convolutional neural network fault identification for a much larger area. This is a beautiful data set that came to us via the Railroad Commission and the TextNet scissor collaboration of from the Fairfield company. And we ran the fault interpretation using a wide variety of different attributes, and then looked at several extractions of the fault interpretation for particular horizons. And this apparently is for the basement surface. And you can see, for instance, the first picture shows the structure. The second one shows a really basic seismic attribute such as variance. Then we unleash the fault AI and we get a lot more detail. The fault AI in 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁𝗁, as you'll probably hear in later presentations, they can be refined even further. So you can end up with a skeletonized version of the fault, which can then, in the right picture, be turned into planes that can then be utilized in three-dimensional geological modeling. And here's some more examples of what these fault interpretations, these extractions look like from 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁𝗁 for various zones. I think in the upper left-hand corner, I show the Bell Canyon horizon, which is more shallow. The basement, of course, at the bottom with lots and lots of basement-rooted faults. And then we look at both the fault AI as well as the fault skeletons and see how well the actual fault identification matches the overall structure horizons that were obtained using the seismic interpretation. So very, very encouraging results from the 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁𝗁 convolutional neural network fault extraction. And then, of course, we did much more verification on the actual faults. We went to the same sort of exercise I told you about a little bit earlier. There's a report out from a geologist from the Bureau of Economic Geology, Lily Horn, who has manually interpreted faults on this particular basement surface. Those are in blue. Then I overlay the blue onto the structural horizons and start comparing it against the exact same convolutional neural network extracted faults from 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗁𝗁. And I'll let you be the judge of how well the manual faults corroborate the actual AI extracted faults. Some details about that. Here we're looking at multiple scenario. Yeah, it's the same thing, just a zoomed in version. And then I start switching the actual comparison between the manually interpreted faults starting at a shallower surface, the Bell Canyon on the left, moving down in the section, going deeper to the first Bone Spring Lime, the famous Woodford surface, and you can see how the manually interpreted faults from the geologists match the actual AI convolutional neural network extracted faults, then down to the all-important Ellenberger as well as the basements. Very good matches. So what do we learn from that? Well, I can tell you is that this convinced me that I will never look at another 3D seismic volume again without first running the 𝗕𝗿𝗁 AI fault extraction software. It immediately pulls your eye towards the areas where you need to go in and look for the faults. It identifies the faults. It identifies faults that we didn't even know were there, right? And that is an absolute critical part of building a coherent, integrated 3D geological models. These faults are not just important as it relates to the actual earthquake, seismicity activity, but also for fluid transitions, for overall drilling hazards, and so on and so forth. Fault interpretation is absolutely critical to the development initiatives and the oil and gas production and exploration activities that the oil companies undertake in the Permian Basin. Good. How are we doing on time? Oh, okay. So then, of course, we need some sort of additional validation. Well, we've got the seismic data. We can see the faults in the seismic, and then we can get 𝗕𝗿𝗁 to identify those faults. But what additional validation do we have? Well, that's where some really interesting machine learning work is being done in the TextNet group over at the Bureau of Economic Geology, where we use machine learning in order to calculate or discover lower magnitude earthquakes, right? And that's a whole talk unto itself. Yang-Kang Chen has published on this in the TextNet group, and if you're interested in that, because that particular data has gone a long way in helping to validate faults where before we had far fewer of those spheres that you see hanging in 3D to help us validate this sort of data. And even more excitedly, most recently, some of my 𝗕𝗿𝗁 results I brought in as these two colored surfaces that you see right there, the green one and the pink one, and I compare that to our latest run of machine learning extracted and identified seismicity data, and I had an almost perfect match with just a minor adjustment in the overall positioning of the faults, which of course is well within the error bar that is created by the velocity models that we use for this particular area in the Delaware Basin. So now it gets interesting. We're using the 𝗕𝗿𝗁 fault interpretation together with the seismicity data in order to truly validate these faults, and that's critical when it comes to the analysis of the saltwater disposal and seismicity research that we do in the Jackson School. Just a quick picture that I like, but that's a geeky 3D modeling picture. The modern technology, this used to take us days to do a unfolding, a geospace to depot space unfolding, you know? And now we literally do it in minutes. And that is a whole talk by itself. And I never delete that slide, but it's so cool what we can do these days with three-dimensional modeling software in optimizing our overall petrophysical distributions, taking all the tectonic and faulting information into account and being able to transform that. So that complex picture that you just looked at is just a picture of all of the data that we have in the southern Delaware Basin with all the faults and the earthquakes and the horizontal wells and so on and so forth. And I think it's waiting for me to press a button. Yes, there it is. That's just a cross-section through the famous 𝗣𝗿𝗁 structure that 𝗣𝗿𝗁𝗆 imaged for us several decades ago. Beautiful data set. But one of the things that we really need to do is to take all of the fault information and somehow use the faults in the three-dimensional model. Now, why is that so important? Well, look what happens if we actually take, for instance, the important velocity data and we distribute it without fault data. You see this area right here? It leaks through the faults, right? Because that distribution was done without any fault information. Those black lines are the faults, and now what we're capable of doing is actually do perfectly field faulted frameworks for the entire Permian Basin, actually constraining the velocity distributions, removing all of these artifacts, making our time depth conversions and our earthquake relocations all that more accurate. So you can see why I'm such a big fan of the fault interpretation in 𝗕𝗿𝗁𝗆. But what was even more exciting was the self-organized maps as combined with the lithophasies prediction workflow. So I really have to point you to our AEPG President, Deborah Zachary's many webinars and papers to tell you all about the exciting use of self-organized maps as it relates to the interpretation of geology. It's an amazing tool. And for those of us that do exploration or development in oil and gas, this is one of the most exciting things that I've run into in the 30 years that I've been active in this particular industry. So I'm really looking forward to your talk. So there is a talk about karsting, and that's one of the things that we were able to highlight in the actual lithophasies work here in the Delaware Basin. And these are just some examples of the work that we did using the self-organized map geobody extraction representing specific facies distributions in the form of geobodies in 3D, showing it across large areas. You know, that's more than 100 miles from north to south here in the Delaware Basin. Lots of examples of these facies distributions, and that's what makes it so important. If you can do this sort of facies distributions over that many seismic volumes so quickly and efficiently, right? Now you want to merge it with all of your petrophysical data in order to be able to then link these particular lithofacies predictions to the actual petrophysical data. And that is one of the gold standards. That is the holy grail right there. If we can combine these things, then we can come up with distributions of porosity, permeability, and water saturations through the entire Permian Basin. That's what we're doing right now. Right? For those engineers here in the room, for instance, that do reservoir simulation, key to have that information. And tools like 𝗕𝗿𝗃𝗁 actually help us get there much, much faster than any other technique that I've ever used in my entire career. So merging the actual lithofacies predictions with the petrophysical data is the holy grail. So last year, I had the opportunity to run what 𝗣𝗿𝗱𝗆𝗆 will talk about today is the lithofacies prediction workflow in 𝗕𝗿𝗃𝗁. What I did is I basically took the software and tried to validate it for myself. And when somebody says, okay, we've got a revolutionary new tool that can do better lithofacies prediction, well then, one of the things I usually do is I grab one of the projects that I've done in the past, and I just run the software. So Charlie Cairns and I put together a model in the Midland Basin that was in a field owned by Oxy Midland Farms Unit, where we developed an entire workflow to identify what you see right here, ooid grainstone distributions in both the San Andres and the 𝗕𝗿𝗃𝗁𝗆 formations. Now, San Andres, you may be familiar with, right now it's being targeted very heavily for saltwater disposal. So all of those complex structures right there of great interest to all of the operators operating in the Permian Basin. And of course, the 𝗕𝗿𝗃𝗁𝗆 has been the host to many, many large reservoirs. So Charlie and I basically, we use his core data, combined it with my workflows in the 𝗕𝗍𝗍𝗆𝗍 software in order to come up with a much higher resolution model for the actual stratigraphy. And if I'm not mistaken, this particular little video shows a large area of the Midland Basin. We're looking towards the north, and you can see from these colors of this acoustic impedance straddle slice how the actual progradation, you know, and the retrogradation of these various interfingering layers are basically documented through time. So what you're looking at is a very complex geological depositional environment that we're effectively modeling in time in order to be able to get a much better three-dimensional stratigraphic framework that we can then be merged with petrophysical data in order to become much more predictive. So doing all that work in ELISE and PaleoScan and building all of these layers and stuff like that, ultimately to be able to create these ooid grainstone geobodies, right, which are targeted for a production, or in some cases are very tight, and then relate to the saltwater disposal. What we have to do is a bunch of work. You saw me build models, do the seismic interpretation, build more models, integrate it with Charlie's core data, and all of that work is fairly time-consuming. But ultimately, we can get to a point where we can get very quantitative about these ooid grainstone geobodies, and that's absolutely critical for the exploration and development of this field. So ultimately, that particular study took Charlie and me approximately 9 weeks before we were able to then cut into one of these ooid grainstone geobodies and look at the actual porosity and permeability distribution within one of those. So I had that project. I'd done that. We've done that work. We presented it. And then I started hearing about some of these people. Yeah? And I started talking to 𝗕𝗁, and 𝗕𝗁 was kind enough to help facilitate the donation. And then I started looking at all the webinars from 𝗣𝗿𝗱𝗆𝗁 and from our AEPG president, and I got very excited. I said, wait a second. this might actually work, but proof's in the pudding. You got to try it yourself. So I locked myself up in my office on a Saturday, and I then basically ran the exact same workflow that I just showed you. And I'll skip over these slides because we're going to get into lots of the detail of the self-organized maps and the lithofacies here in a little bit, right? Here you can see all of the volumes that I use in order to be able to condition the self-organized maps. And these are the well logs that I used, as well as the facies distributions. And then basically what I came up with in 𝗕𝗿𝗿𝗺𝗶𝗰 and what it helped me facilitate is link the neurons from the self-organized map exercise to the actual petrophysical facies data from my well logs. Right? And that enabled me to create the same sort of cliniform ooid grainstone geobodies in this particular field from 𝗲𝗄𝗃 in the Midland Basin. Right? And then I had a chance to compare that against our core data, validate the actual accuracy thereof, and here's some views from the 𝗕𝗿𝗿𝗺𝗺 software that enabled me, and then look at the three-dimensional distribution, the connectivity and the continuity of these various grainstones in 3D, and I was able to replicate the exact same work on coming up with these three-dimensional grainstone distributions, right? So critical for the development of this field. But instead of using, 3 weeks, or maybe even more time, considering all of the work running up to it, and I did it all in under 12 hours. Then I went back and I compared it to all of our previous data. We looked at the distribution of the core data, and we saw that the actual results from the lithofacies distribution from 𝗕𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺 were much more accurate than any other technique that we have used theretofore, including a wide variety of geostatistical techniques. We did the same thing in the field from 𝗲𝗄𝗃 for a particular the Salt Creek field in the Horseshoe Atoll, and I hope to continue to work with you on that one, Deborah. So, and this is what some of those 3D distributions look like. And then, so what you're looking at right here is the same sort of geobodies, right? So why am I so excited about this stuff? A picture like this from 𝗕𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺𝗺. Well, because my original degree was in geology from my home country of the Netherlands in Amsterdam. But I always liked computers. But when I came over here, there was no money for geology at the time in the mid-'80s. So I had no choice. They sent me down to the petroleum engineering department and said, go talk to this 𝗕𝗿𝗍𝗃. And luckily, he took pity on me. And he says, I'll give you money, right? But you have to get a degree with us. So I, as a poor geologist, was tortured for another couple of years in getting another degree. But one of the things I realized is that all of the knowledge I was gaining from my permeability calculation lab work, I could integrate with my geological modeling experience, right? And that was so much fun. That's why ultimately, after 25 years in the industry, I came back to UT in order to continue to do research that merges geology, geophysics, and engineering together. Because if you're capable of coming up with high porosity permeability grainstone ooids distributions in 3D, it makes the difference between being successful in landing a horizontal well, or recompleting a field, or setting up a CO2 EOR study, right? If you know how to combine all the technologies together and within the framework of those disciplines. So we want to communicate that. And how are we going to communicate that? Well, and that picture I showed you a little bit earlier is that these are my top 3 tools that I use. And then I have to explain this. And at the Jackson School, who do we explain it to? Students, fellow researchers, and the people that contribute lots of money to our consortium, right? Then we actually write peer-reviewed publications. But peer-reviewed publications are just, it's not as much bandwidth as I'd like. Luckily, recently, with the help of my friends at Creative Technologies, coincidentally a Dutch company, we have been able to take all of our reservoir models and all of our stories that we've developed, combining all the technologies, and put them in a 3-dimensional virtual reality room. So this is how we communicate this. So in the back of the room, I have a couple of virtual reality headsets. And for those of you that have time this afternoon to hang back, we'll be able to put one of these things on your head, and then you'll see in glorious 3-dimensional visualization, core data, seismic data, results from 𝗕𝗿𝗺𝗺𝗺𝗺, as well as fault data, all in integrated 3-dimensional models for the purpose, not just of visualization, but communication, right? What we do with these rooms is that we can invite any person anywhere in the world to the room to have a discussion. So what we're using it is with our collaborators in England. I was just doing this last week. There was a professor at Liverpool, and he and I are working on a particular project. I got him to go join me in the room, but he didn't have a headset. So he said, well, how can I use this room? No problem. He could do it on his phone, on his iPad, or his PC, or if you're lucky and you have one of those headsets, in glorious virtual reality 3D, where everything becomes instantly stereoscopic. So that's some of the stuff that we will be showing more of our future Paradise results in these sorts of rooms. We have a room in Houston as well that we'll be using for several of the consortia at the Bureau of Economic Geology. And then the sorts of demos that we're showing right here is, for instance, the 3D seismic with three-dimensional geobody results from the Paradise software. Great. And so in summary, you combine all these technologies, all of these disciplines, and you make sure you collect every single scrap of data, and then we can build models that have the right sort of data sets that lend themselves for machine learning exercises. Right? And I think that here at the Jackson School, we've been able to do that with the help, of course, of the various data and software donors, as well as a large number of companies that contribute to our various consortia. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.